Hello, fellow adventurers, and welcome back to a very special episode of Word Safari. As you can see, we are on location in an unusual place. We are on Grand Mesa in western Colorado, and I am here with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Jackson Crawford, whom many of you know from his own YouTube channel. If you recall, in our last excursion, which was Excursion 23, Daily Planets Part 1, we traced the evolution of the names of planets from their Babylonian origins through Greek and on into the Roman system. And we talked about how the planet names were originally names of gods in these systems, and they all formed a system of essentially 7 planets that the Greeks then used to form weekdays out of and form a 7-day week where each day of the week was named after one of the 7 planets: the sun, the moon, and then what we would call Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So I left the last excursion at a particular point where the Roman names were being transferred to the Germanic cultures, the Germanic tribes to their north. And I said that we were going to bring in an expert who knows much more about the Germanic mythological system and the Germanic gods than I do. And of course, this is our expert right here, Dr. Jackson Crawford. So thank you for being here.
Well, Luke, it's always a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. And so he's going to give us some great information today on really just, what we know from the older Germanic texts about knowledge of really these two separate but similar things, knowledge of the planets and the stars and astronomy, as far as we can tell from, again, the ancient Germanic texts, and also the weekdays and how those developed from the Old English period into the modern English period. So, Jackson, I figured we would start by talking about some of the prehistory, whatever we know about the prehistory, since we have been talking about the development of astronomical knowledge in the Babylonian system, Greek system, Roman system. A lot of this did come from the Babylonians. The Greeks got it from them. The Romans got it from the Greeks, at least as far as we can tell. So, Jackson, what did the Germanic tribes, who were living to the north of the Roman Empire, but weren't part of it, but had some contacts with the Roman Empire, what, if anything, can we tell about what they knew about planets? Did they really have any concept of 7 planets or any planets in the archaic period that we might call the prehistoric period?
Well, before the conversion to Christianity, it's very hard to say much of anything because the only language in which we have many texts in the first half of the first millennium AD is Gothic. And of course, those texts are Christian texts, right? You're looking at the Bible and then commentaries thereon. With Old Norse, we're probably in a better position than with some of the other languages because there's more of the vernacular literature preserved, but at the same time, that literature is preserved pretty late. And it's kind of happenstance what is preserved. And the period in which so much of that vernacular literature, like the Eddas and the sagas, are written down in the 1200s, is also a time in which Iceland is becoming more incorporated into the mainstream of European Christian scholarly tradition. So you also have a lot of translations of Latinate learned works. And in fact, that's really the only places we see much discussion of the stars. In the Eddas, which are the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, these are our main sources for the myths about the gods and heroes. There's no mention of the planets. There's barely any mention of the stars or of the sun and moon. We know the names of 4 stars in Old Norse, and I'm being generous saying that because some of this may be redundant. They just don't talk about it much. We don't know the Old Norse word for the Aurora Borealis, right? People are always looking for this sort of nature or elemental gods, right? And that's just not what we find in these texts.
Right. So it sounds like from the ancient textual evidence, there's just really not much there when it comes to trying to figure out what they might have known about not just stars, but planets. Definitely no idea of 7 planets in there at all, really.
Right. Well, and I was showing you earlier today, there's a manuscript, GKS 1812 quarto. So that is manuscript number 1812, size quarto, in the Gamle Kongli Samling. And
there will be a spelling test on this, by the way.
Yes, and you can spell it one of 5 ways, depending on what your Scandinavian language of choice is. It's got some very old materials. Parts of it go back to the last half of the 1100s. And it talks about the stars, the constellations, the sun, the moon, mostly as a means of telling time. But it is purely Latinate, right? It's bringing in this learning from another culture and saying, this is what these things are called. This is what you are to call them. These are the names of these stars and these heavenly bodies. This is how they move with respect to one another, of course, from a medieval perspective. And all the names are Latinate, right? And in fact, it's noticeable, and I was pointing out to you earlier, where the planets are named, right? We get like Mercurius, Mars, Jupiter, Saturnus, right? It's just the Latin names. But then the grammatical gender used is feminine. So they're not even thinking about them as the names of the male Latin gods there. They're thinking of it as feminine because the word stjarna, star, in Old Norse is feminine. So that's all, it's just a star, right? It's just what you call those things.
So this is some pretty good evidence that the system that held from the Babylonians through the Greeks into the Romans, where the planets and the god names were very closely connected, and nobody would have, said they were different at all. They would have said, oh yeah, Mercury is a planet and he's also a god. It seems like that system broke down between in the baton handoff, if you will, between the Roman system and the Germanic system, where the Germanic tribes inherited the idea of weekdays, which we're going to get to, and they inherited the planets, but they kind of inherited them as separate systems. They didn't really see them as the same thing. And when they took the planet names over, this is something that you might have been wondering about in the first half of this safari when we were talking about the planet names and tracing them through the evolution. And we saw how the Germanic weekday names were different, but you obviously know that the Germanic planet names, like in English, are not different than the Romans. We still call them Mercury, Venus, Mars, etc. We haven't changed those names.
Right, and the same in every Germanic language.
Every Germanic language, right.
So including Icelandic, which is so conservative.
So the Germanic tribes really just borrowed the planet names from the Roman system, which definitely seems to suggest that they didn't have an idea of 7 planets beforehand. They didn't seem to have names for them. We don't have any evidence that there were native Germanic names, whether they were god names, goddess names, or anything, really, before their contact with the Romans.
Right. And when you see stars and celestial phenomena discussed in the Eddas, it's so vague.
Yeah.
Right. So I also showed you in the Prose Edda where Snorri talks about the creation of the stars and the stars that fly free under heaven, by which he probably means falling stars. And it's just passed over. Right.
Yeah.
Did they just not care? It's possible for a culture to not care. Right. I mean, we have kind of this notion that, oh yeah, at night you look up and you have kind of names for all these things. You don't have to.
Sure. On the other hand, you had the Vikings, who were renowned seafarers, and you were telling me earlier that we just don't really have any good records of how they used the stars to navigate the seas, but presumably they did. Presumably some of the Vikings must have been very adept at looking up at the stars and knowing what they were looking at. But I'm not an expert seafarer, but the stars, the fixed stars, are more important than the planets for navigating, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, I'm not a mariner either, but neither were the scribes writing down the Eddas and sagas and such, right? So even if we have stories of grand explorations far away, and we have many of these in the sagas, going as far as the eastern coast of present-day Canada, going as far as Baghdad, they don't talk about how, right? And people take issue with this sometimes, but there's division of labor already in medieval society to some extent, right? The people navigating these ships are not the same people coming home and copying manuscripts, right? Just like I can get on a plane without knowing how to fly it, right? And I can tell in a story about somebody flying on a plane without mentioning, oh, and by the way, and along the way, the pilot is checking all of these measurements and readouts, right? It's a different world. It's a different career path. So this is just not the same people. They clearly were sophisticated navigators, but the navigators weren't writing anything down.
So it's one of these many, many things from the ancient world that we both, would love to know about in our respective fields regarding the ancient world. But it's just something that we've come to learn that we're never going to know most things. Most of the knowledge is lost, and most of the things that they knew are lost. Most of the texts they ever wrote are lost.
Yep, and that's okay. There's no. You don't have to get upset about it.
Yeah, I look at it as like a glass 100th full instead of 99/100ths empty, right? We have something. We know some stuff from thousands of years ago, which is actually pretty impressive and really cool to study, which is why we both study it all the time and have devoted our lives to this. Okay, so the planets definitely seem to be something that the Germanic tribes really just got straight from the Romans, which again explains why in English we call them Mercury and Venus and everything else, just using the Roman names, because by the time these were borrowed, these weren't really necessarily god names to the Germanic tribes who got them from the Romans. They were just planet names, even if they maybe knew about the gods of the Romans. However, something different happened with the weekday names, which they also got this idea of the week from the Romans, it appears. Now, is there any evidence in ancient Germanic texts that they had any kind of week period?
Well, in Havamal, the Proverbs of Odin, and some other texts, we see frequent references to a unit of 5 days. And so it's possible that that's the original Germanic week, is this 5-day week. Not that we necessarily know what those days of the week would have been called originally.
And they might not have had names even?
And and they might not have even had names.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you can open a whole can of worms speculating about it, but we just,
Sure.
But I think that the possibility of an early 5-day week is pretty strong because of the prominence of that 5-day period.
So there's no hint of a 7-day period.
I cannot think of a place in the archaic Norse literature like the Eddas and early sagas where 7 days means anything. But where 5 days means something, yes. And then 9 is the actual sacred number for them, right? So it's not just that this is like a sacred frequent number, right?
Yeah.
5 seems to somehow be important in terms of days.
Okay, so they definitely seem pretty radically disconnected from this system that we've seen all over the Mediterranean and modern-day Middle East, where 7 is all over the place, and there's 7 planets, and there's 7 weekdays, 7 days of the week. So yeah, they're not really taking part in that cultural system. So it seems pretty clear, I think we can say, that they got the idea of a 7-day week from the South, from the Romans, or maybe some Greeks they talked to, but either way, the South, the Mediterranean cultures. Sure. Probably the Romans, because they had the most contact with them.
Sure. I mean, this gets into all kinds of complicated questions. I tend to think that the Futhark, the runes, come from Greek, maybe indirectly, but yeah. So, but it's coming from the Mediterranean world.
Yeah, or Etruscans even. I mean, let's not give the Etruscans short shrift. I mean, they're not here anymore to call us on it, but
Who knows? I mean, the 70 week is probably a Mediterranean thing for them. Yeah.
Okay, so they get the idea of 7-day week almost certainly from the Mediterranean. It's not something that was native to their culture. Granted, it wasn't originally native to Roman culture either. Sure. The Romans did not have a 7-day week in archaic Latin literature. So they definitely got that from the Greeks. And the Greeks, as we've been talking about, probably got it from the east, from the Semitic cultures to their east originally. So we can kind of trace the evolution of this, which is pretty cool. So the Germanic tribes get this idea of a 7-day week, and by the time they come into contact with the Romans, it's a very well-established, or a being well-established 7-day week, and we'll talk a little bit more about timing here. The 7-day week was, as we talked about in the first half of this safari, the last video, the 7-day week was really becoming established in the Roman Empire about the 1st century, which is, early Germanic context probably would have been, contacts would have been happening around then. So by the time you get really robust contacts between the Germanic tribes and the Roman Empire, the 7-day week would have been very well established.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, we know there's a lot of contact in the first couple centuries AD. There's already loan words and such coming in that are in all the Germanic languages. Like the merchant word, the Kalp word. Yeah, absolutely. So they almost certainly got this, and like I said, we will talk a little bit more about timing as we go on. But for now, I want to pivot to actually talking about the specific names of the days of the week, which is really the central focus of this video here. And that's sort of what we left the last video with. We talked about how there are these 7 days, and they're named after the 7 planets in the Greek and Roman system. And the Germanic peoples who came into contact with the Romans got this idea of the 7-day week, also got the idea of each name of each day of the 7-day week from the Romans. And we talked about how the first 2 days, the day of the sun and the day of the moon, I mean, they just translated into Sunday and Moon Day, aka Monday. That was pretty simple. And then it got a little bit more complicated. So Jackson, I'd definitely like to hear from you about these 4 gods in succession. And I don't know if there's an order to do these in that would make sense. Why don't we start with Thor, because he might be the easiest. So the Germanic
peoples who came into contact with these Romans said, okay, what are your names for these 4 days of the week in the middle, what we would call Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. And as we talked about, what we would today call Thursday was the day of Jupiter in the Roman system. So tell us a little bit, and I'm sure a lot of the viewers know a lot of this stuff already, but let's pretend they don't. Why would the Germanic peoples, whoever made this translation, and we were talking about how it might have just been a one-time thing. This might have been one person or group of people who did this once, and then it spread all over the Germanic cultures. And there are a few reasons to maybe think that. Why would they have picked each of these gods? Starting with Thor. So Thursday is, of course, just Thor's day. It's the day of the god Thor, which, of course, we know everybody knows about today, even if you don't know about Germanic mythology, thanks to Hollywood, right? So why would they have picked Thor for Jupiter? That's the one we're going to start with.
All right, so we take Jupiter's or Jove's day, and we wind up with an Old English Thunris day, because in fact his name in Old English is Thunor, which is the word thunder.
Thunder, yeah.
It is that word. And then, of course, in Old Norse, Thor, so you get Old Norse Thorsdagar. Thor is a pretty easy god to identify with Jupiter because both are prominent, popular, active male deities, right? And Thor really is the central protagonist in Norse mythology as we have it preserved. He seems to be the most popular of the gods based on the fact that his name occurs in all kinds of places, all kinds of people's names. People are buried with little Thor's hammers, hundreds of them. And he's also associated with thunder, as his name suggests. I dislike the practice of saying so-and-so's god of X, so-and-so's goddess of Y, because it's an oversimplification, and so everybody calls Thor the god of thunder. He doesn't actually do that much. It's all that associated with thunder. But his name is Thunder. On one occasion, when he shows up to fight Hrungnir, there's thunder and lightning flash. And his weapon, Mjolnir, hammer, is an old word for lightning. So it's easy. Popular, powerful male god associated with thunder.
Right, so you can see that whoever did this probably just latched on to the alpha male, the thunder, and said that sounds a lot like the Roman Jupiter. So let's call this, if we're going to translate the name from the Roman system into the Germanic system, we're going to call Jove or Jupiter's day Thor's day, right?
Yeah, easy enough. And also, it doesn't ever look to me, this is a little bit of a hobby horse I can get onto, but the Norse pantheon isn't really organized, right? We have this sort of organized idea of the Olympian pantheon, however much that applied in different parts of Greece and Rome and areas influenced by them. But for the Norse, probably different areas are worshiping different gods more than other areas. We see the names of gods and place names cluster real heavily in different areas. So if it sounds strange that Thor is not the head of the pantheon, of course that's coming from a perspective influenced by the Eddas, which are written in Iceland late in the period of anyone passing these stories on. The situation could be very different in Sweden or England or some other place where these stories weren't written down as much. And it also doesn't look like the ranking of the gods matters that much. Just because Jupiter's the highest ranking god in the Roman system doesn't mean, A, that Thor isn't in the Norse system in different places, but also that that's even what the person translating this is thinking about.
Right, and there really is a lot more diversity in some of these systems than people realize. I mean, when you go back to the archaic Greek system even, we have Greek mythology today, and we kind of have this homogenized version that we teach in the classroom and you read about in books. But when you go back to a lot of those archaic stories, it is very localized. You have certain cities worshiping certain gods and not caring as much about other ones, and often telling different stories about different gods. So there isn't necessarily this really neat, clean pantheon in a lot of these ancient systems. So speaking of which, we've talked about Thor. Let's go back to Tuesday. That might be the next logical one, to talk about, unless you wanted to go somewhere else.
Yeah. The next one that's fairly easy after Thor is Odin.
Okay, let's go to Odin.
So we have Mercury's day, right? Mercredi.
Yeah.
And then in English it's Old English Wednesday, because you have two different forms of the name of this god in Old English. You have Woden and then Wedin with I umlaut. And then the Old Norse form of his name is Odin. Old Norse always loses W's before O's. It's the same reason why it's English worm, Old Norse Ormer. So Old English Wednesday, modern Wednesday, and Old Norse Odin's Dagar. And this is a fairly easy identification too. We think of Odin as the head of the pantheon in our classical picture of Norse mythology from the Eddas today too. But leaving aside his quote-unquote rank, whatever it might have been to whoever was doing this, He's a psychopomp, and he travels between the different realms. He visits the dead, right? He is a traveling god, and that he's in that way very analogous to Mercury.
Absolutely.
So it makes a lot of sense to me, actually.
Yeah, so just with the traveling, the duties as a psychopomp, which by the way is a fancy Greek word for somebody who takes your soul to the afterlife when you die. So yeah, it's easy to see how the person or people who are trying to create these relationships here or correspondences said Mercury / Hermes sounds a lot like Odin or Woden, however that person would have pronounced it in their dialect, and that's where we get Woden's Day, Wednesday, essentially from. Where do you want to go next?
Friday. So we have Latin Veneris Dies, right? Day of Venus, or potentially of love, right? So this one gets a little bit interesting. In Old English, we have Friaday. So Fria would be the genitive of the Old English cognate of the Old Norse goddess name Frigg. Now, Frigg, in spite of the fact that kind of looking like something you say when you're trying to avoid saying the other F word in front of a 5-year-old, is actually from an old love root, right, that we see in Sanskrit, Priya.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's in English friend, right, the loving one. Now, in the Eddas, we really just know her as the wife of Odin. But there's another goddess, Frøya, superficially similar name, whose name literally just means lady. It's the cognative German Frau. And it is likely, and I've discussed this at length elsewhere, and it does take some getting into the weeds, that Frøya and Frigg might once have just been one, right? The name Frøya isn't known outside of Scandinavia. The name Frigg is, just like her brother Frøy, who's also known as Yngvi. Only his name Yngvi is known outside of Scandinavia. So maybe what's happened is this goddess, who was originally like Lady Frigg, right? Like Frøya, Frigg, Frøya.
Lady Love.
Yeah, Lady Love. She's been split, which that sort of thing happens easily when these traditions are being transmitted by people who are no longer active practitioners of the underlying belief system, or even while they are. Okay, so she's being picked as as an analogous figure to Venus, right? Whether she is originally the same person as Frøy or not. But what's interesting is that in Old Norse, in Iceland and Norway, this day is not named for Frigg, which we would expect Friggjardagur. It's named Frjoldagur, which is literally just Love Day. Same root as in her name, but it's Love Day, which I guess Dies Veneris would be in Latin too, right?
Metonymically, yes.
Yeah. So that's interesting.
Right. It would be interesting to try to trace this back to the original place and time of translation, which is something we're going to wrap up this safari with. So let's not get too into it now. Let's go on to Tuesday then. This is the most difficult one of the four, possibly interesting, possibly the most interesting one of the four.
Yeah, to me it's difficult.
Yeah.
So, all right. So there's a god in the Eddas named Tyr, and we basically know that we know one really interesting story about him, which is that when the gods had Fenrir, the wolf who will eventually kill Odin, within the enclosure of their city, they could not harm the wolf because no blood can be drawn in Oskar, the enclosure of the gods. But they wanted to bind it, and it was too strong to be held in any bindings they could make. So they had some dwarves make bindings out of things that don't exist, right? To make bindings
works every time.
Yeah, well, because if you want to bind something that can break any bindings, you have to have, by definition, those would be bindings that don't exist. You have to make it out of stuff that doesn't exist. So they make it out of fish's breath, maybe some of the trout that we just saw over here. Cats' footfalls, women's beards, that kind of thing.
Not dwarves, humans.
Not right. Okay, so when they bring this new chain to the wolf Fenrir, he's suspicious of it. You know, maybe this one looks like one he might actually break out of, because they've been kind of making a game out of him just breaking out of everything. And he says, I don't know, fellas, I see some fish's breath or something in there. He's suspicious, and he says, one of you needs to put your hand on my mouth as a pledge that this won't actually bind me for, until Ragnarok or something, guys. So Tyr is the only god who will do it. He puts his right hand in the wolf's mouth. Of course, the chain does bind him, so the wolf bites Tyr's hand off. So he's the one-handed god. That is the thing we really know about him. Otherwise, he shows up kind of marginally here and there. He and Thor go to visit his father, who is a quote-unquote giant. That's another whole hobby horse. The giants are the same family as the gods. Basically, they're just rival family members. He goes with Thor to visit his dad, which, I mean, it could be anybody. Tyr doesn't play a special role there. He's in a few other peripheral. He's a peripheral in some other stories. He's not a huge presence in the Eddas. That's curious because his name is exactly cognate with Zeus.
You just do Grimm's Law, D to T.
Yeah, it's the exact same name.
So it really looks like he used to be more important in the pantheon.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be surprising if this shows up as a major sky god in Greece and Italy because Jupiter.
Yeah.
Deus Pitar in the Vedas is perhaps not Indra prominent, but he's
right.
But he's
there.
He's there.
It's a name.
So is this? Of course, the Indo-European pantheon might have been not very organized either.
Probably not, honestly.
Yeah. So it could be that the sky god gets a lot of prominence in Greece and Rome as agriculture gets so important there. I don't
sure.
know.
Rain.
Yeah, and just less important somehow in the north. Who knows? But his name is Zeus, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So this makes a lot of people speculate, and you can find this. Just Google him on the internet, and you'll find more speculation than not about him having originally been the main god. Who knows? Maybe. I'm not willing to say that he was, because he's definitely not in the Eddas. Okay, so why is he given Mars Day, right? Why is he the equivalent to Mahdi? I don't know. Right? Mars is a martial god. I just used two.
Yeah.
The same word in that sentence. He's a warlike god. All of the Norse gods are warlike, right? So it seems
not saying much.
Yeah, it seems like you could pick literally any one of them.
Yeah. So why did Tew get chosen? Tew, same guy, right?
Yeah, Tew is the Old English.
Yeah. So why did this particular god get chosen?
I don't know. It doesn't. He's. Again, I hate these labels, god of whatever. He's not god of. If anybody's god of war, it's Odin, because he's the one that gets people killed in wars every day of the week.
It's a strange choice.
Yeah, it is to me. Well, because also the main personality characteristic of Tyr that I think about is the honesty, right? He's the one who's willing to put his hand in the mouth of the wolf, and that's not something I think of with Ares.
Yeah, well, and even Ares and Mars are not the same character. I mean, we oftentimes simplistically equate Greco-Roman deities with each other, the Greeks and the Romans, and often it works. But in the case of Ares and Mars, this is one case where the Romans took a look at Ares and then took a look at their native war god Mars and said, no, we're not going to make our god more like that guy, because Ares really doesn't have a great reputation in the Greek pantheon, but the Romans loved Mars. They really looked up to Mars, and Mars has honor and dignity and things like that in a way that the Greek Ares doesn't. So if they were getting it from the Roman Mars and not the Greek Ares, that's closer maybe, but still not that close. But we don't know. We don't really know that much about Tew. And they were all warriors, so could have been a warrior, sure, but why him particularly?
Here's a random thought. Are there pledges to Mars? Is Mars a pledge or oath figure? Because then I could see an association with Tyr.
Yeah. Well, I think the Romans would have done that sometimes just because he was their chief war god and they were such a warlike culture. Like, it would have been probably normal to make pledges to him before going into battle or something like that.
Okay. I mean, maybe somewhere in there is the connection. Or it could just be, again, we have the Eddas written in Iceland in the 1200s. We're talking about identifications made in the first millennium. It's hard to know what stories were circulating then. And what stories are circulating where. Tyr could well have had a prominence that we don't know of from the Icelandic Eddas. Or it could be that it was much the same as the situation we see in the Icelandic Eddas, where you have four figures that actually play the biggest role in the stories: Odin, Thor, Loki, and Freyja, who might have once been the same as Frigg. And, they've already named days after Odin and Thor, so it's like, well, who's another male god? So,
who do we got left that makes sense?
This Tyr, this Njordr, this Freyr, it's like kind of pick one. You probably wouldn't do Freyr because his name would sound more like Frigg or Freyja, but yeah.
Interesting. So it sounds like the way to look at this might be to say they did Wednesday and Thursday first.
That's what it looks like to me, yeah.
And then Friday kind of fell into place.
Thursday's easy, Wednesday's easy, Friday's easy enough. Tuesday is
like, what do we do with this one? Yeah. Mars.
Because again, all the gods are warlike.
Right.
Yeah.
And that leads us to the final day of the week that's not Sunday or Monday, and that is Saturday, Saturn's Day. And this one, of course, is interesting, as we talked about last time, because they didn't translate this one, unlike the other four, which is strange. Like, why would they leave the job undone? So can you give us a little bit of an idea of why they might not have translated Saturn?
Well, this one is interesting because it's actually really different. around the Germanic-speaking world. So, of course, as you know, in English, we have Saturdays, which we just take the Roman god's name and just move it over. In Germany, you have Sonntag, which is from Sabbath day.
So they just use the Romance system for that, basically.
Same as like in Spanish.
Yeah.
In some areas, Sonnenabend, which is just Sunday evening, Sunday Eve. And then in Scandinavia, it's Bath Day, right? So in Old Norse, Laugardagar, that's become, for example, modern Icelandic, Laugardagar and Laugardagur, and modern Norwegian Laurdagur Lurdag. So why, right? And there's a lot of speculation about this. Saturn is, of course, a pretty negative figure. So if you're trying to translate this into gods' names that you know from your own region, you might say, well, why would I name a day after a nasty god?
Also, just to jump in, he's kind of a strange figure in the mythology. Saturn/Kronos is the father of Zeus/Jupiter. And he's been overthrown, and he's not in power anymore. Of course, he's immortal, so he's still alive, but he's not really doing much, which is kind of how he's a negative figure that has kind of receded from the scene, which may be why the Greeks originally chose Kronos for the planet Saturn, being furthest away, receded from the scene, maybe. So did the Germanic tribes have anything like him in their mythology?
Well, I would point out there's not any real significance to the older generation than the current generation of Aesir gods. We do know their ancestry, beginning with the first living being Ymir, who's technically a giant, right? One of the enemy species. And then, we have names for like the father of Odin and his uncle and his mom, but they're nobodies in the mythology.
Is there a succession myth in the Norse mythology where the modern gods have overthrown former gods?
Well, Odin and his brothers have murdered the original living being.
Okay, but they murdered them. Like you can die. Yeah. If you can die as a god in Norse mythology. Interesting.
Yeah, that's actually a really big part of Norse mythology. So the gods all eventually die. Yeah.
Right.
But they do murder the first living being.
Okay.
That's really the story about him, because the earth is made out of him.
Okay. So one of those characters might have been the obvious pick if they were going to say, okay, who's a former ruler that was overthrown. But if they're murdered, they're not even here anymore. That might be a little different than Saturn or Kronos, who are still here. They're still alive. They're immortal in the Greco-Roman system.
And honestly, I think that's probably the best explanation for it, is there's just not an obvious parallel. Now, another idea that's been bruited about, a suggestion that perhaps the equivalent that they considered was Loki. Now, again, you probably don't want to name a day after a negative figure. So the English just decided, well, we won't have a Loki day, we'll just have a Saturn day, because nobody knows what Saturn is. And then the Norse just picked a day, it's kind of a taboo. Something kind of sounds like Loki, but isn't. So instead of Lokadagar, you have Lagerdagar, Bath Day. And since, I guess you might as well have a reminder of what day to get clean up.
Yeah, take your weekly bath.
Yeah, which, by the way, for medieval times, that's
quite a bit.
Yeah, that's
every week. Whew.
Yeah, that's suspiciously much.
Yeah, so that's a very interesting theory as far as this possibility that maybe Loki was the original god that was considered to be, carrying over the legacy of Saturn into the Germanic system, and then it might have just been rejected for the most part.
Yeah, I mean, for the record, I'm not saying that's the case. I'm sharing an idea that I don't think is crazy, but I think that perhaps the equivalence of Saturn to someone like Ymir, the first living being, is a little bit more persuasive than to Loki. But who knows, right? And part of this ties into, when did this happen?
Right, and that's the last thing I want to get to, talking about the when and the where and the who, some of these really interesting questions that we're not going to be able to answer with any kind of, definitiveness, but there might be some little hints here as to when, where, who might have done this. So yeah, Jackson, last thing that I wanted to talk about here was what we were just mentioning, the who, what, when, where. I think we know why, probably, how of this transition. Are there any clues that we can pick up on?
Yeah, so the earliest place I'm aware of where these names of the days of the week with the Germanic gods in them, my earliest awareness of this is in Old English literature. And it already seems pretty well established in the earliest Old English literature. So let's say conservatively the 800s AD. It is interesting that you see the same names in Germany and Scandinavia. So presumably this decision is being made once. The the best evidence that it happened one time is that they all go with Tuesday for Mars.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because Tyr is such a random god in the Eddas. I just think that if this had been done differently or separately in England and Scandinavia and in Germany, you would have like a Njord day and a Tyr day and like a Frey day, right? It wouldn't be all Tyr, because Tyr just doesn't seem that significant ethically. Okay, but then, did this happen before the conversion? Or did it happen after the conversion?
Because Christianity would have been the conversion of Christianity would have been a sensible time for people to adopt a 7-day week, because of course in the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Christian Bible, you have a 7-day week. So if it hadn't happened by that point, it probably would have happened then, but it might have happened before.
Yeah, and I think there's reason to think it could have actually happened in a Christian context in England. So in English, Old English language sermons, we find pretty consistent, what's the best way to put this, reinforcement of any named Roman god or Norse or Germanic god with the other. So they'll say, like, for example, the Danes who worship Thor, or as we might say, Jove.
Interesting.
Right? Or something like, some Roman writer spoke of a temple to Mercury, or as we might say of old times here, Woden. So there's some equivalence, like there's a learned equivalence that's already understood in England and the early Christian period. It could have been an early Christian who just says, okay, this is the English name of this god, because you have that Interpretatio Germanica, which is just the same as Interpretatio Romana before, where they think all these gods are the same. They're just known by different names in different places, right? Ares is Mars, is maybe Tyr, right? Hermes is Mercury, is Woden.
Right, and that's an interesting thing to consider, because if we were thinking about it, we might just assume that this was a pagan thing, because they're pagan gods that we're using here in both, of course, the Roman system and the Germanic system. So maybe the default thing we would assume is, hey, this was pre-Christian, and this was done by pagans for pagans, and then later on they got Christianized. But you're saying that might not be the case.
Yeah, I'm not convinced that it is the case. There's just, what advantage do pre-Christian tribes without much interaction with the Roman Empire or the later Christian world have for a 7-day week?
Right, and this might be one of those things that, like we were talking about at the beginning of this video, with the idea of what they knew about the stars or even the planets, it might just be lost to history.
Yeah, the 7-day week is natural to us, by the way, but it became natural to us because of the church, right? It's the church that had a reason to know when Sunday was.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. Any ideas about where this might have happened? It sounds like maybe you're leaning, well, maybe not leaning, but you're pondering the idea that this could have happened in England.
Yeah. I think England is probably your best bet, because it is the first Germanic-speaking country not only to become completely Christianized, but also is a major missionary center for the other Germanic language countries. So a lot of Germany is converted by English missionaries, most of Scandinavia by English missionaries. So it makes sense as a jumping off point. Now, it would be interesting, I could be totally proven wrong if these exact days of the week show up in Gothic, but I am 98% sure sitting here that these names are not listed anywhere in Gothic.
Yeah, I don't think they are either, and we didn't double check before this video, but I'm pretty sure they're not.
No, I tried to.
Oh, you did? Okay.
But
yeah,
I can't swear that I've seen everything in Gothic.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, no, me either. Not that it's a big corpus, but it's mostly the New Testament.
Yeah.
And you get days like first day of the week in the New Testament, but there's no Sunday, Monday, Tuesday.
Right. You get Sabbath, right?
Sabbath.
Yeah.
And first day.
Right. And I mean, I've read the New Testament, and I don't remember the days of the week being mentioned other than Sabbath.
No, because the New Testament was written right during that period in the first century when that 7-day system of Sunday, Monday, Tuesday was just starting to catch on and really become popular. And of course, the Jews were pretty conservative as it was, so they wouldn't have just picked up something new in the first century anyways.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think it is in Gothic. I would also be surprised to find out that it was there, unless there was just some Interpretatio Gothica or something where they're translating Sunday or first day as Sunday. But I would be surprised.
Right. So Often at the end of sitting here and talking about things that I don't know and things that are a little bit speculative, um, people have wanted to know, well, what do I think? Well, I'll tell you what I think is the most likely scenario, but of course I can't vouch for it. I think most likely these days the week were named by basically the first generation of English Christians.
Okay. And what century would that put us in again? 6th, 7th?
That's going to be more like 7th, yeah. So that's earlier than we really have anything written down.
Right.
But still, it's consistent all across England. I think perhaps, the closest thing they had to an equivalent to Saturn was someone like Emir. That didn't make sense, so they just went with Saturday. And, maybe Saturday sounded enough like Sabbath that that's what they went with in Germany. I don't know. Right. But that's I think it's very likely that the 7-day week is basically imported with Christianity, and that we see, today there's this oppositional
pagans versus Christians.
Yeah, right. It's there's a really good word that I'm looking for and I can't find it. It's almost Manichaean, like this.
Yeah.
Between
dualistic.
Yeah, between Christianity and pagan.
Right.
But in fact, the Catholic Church can be pretty tolerant of local traditions.
Sure.
Especially when they can be a little bit analogized to classical traditions. And that's exactly what they're doing with the names of these gods and the days of the week. It's not like they remember who Woden and Thor are and such in England much after this. And by the way, in the one country where they do remember who the Norse gods are, Iceland, right, the country where we actually have stories about them in the Eddas, they changed the names of the days of the week in the 1100s. They're originally Tuesday, Odin's Day, Thursday, Frigg's Day, but then a bishop in I want to say the 1180s actually decided that he didn't want these reminders of the pagan gods, and so he changed it to 3rd day, midweek day, 5th day, and fast day.
How about that? So it's really not predictable.
Yep. Well, and also I think that's telling that it's the country where people remember these are gods and remember stories about them that they change it.
Right. And so, as you said, first generation of Christians would probably be more likely than 4th generation of Christians, where some of these gods would have been forgotten and they would have been like, who's Woden?
Right. In a generation where they're still pulling out some step stools for recent converts, I think it's when you're going to see that.
Right. And another sort of possibly tangential detail, England is the only place that the Germanic tribes are living during this period that was part of the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that what we would today call England, what the Romans called Britannia, had a 7-day week and had these day names because it was part of the Roman Empire. And so when the Germanic tribes crossed the English Channel from Frisia, and came to England and named it England, there was already a 7-day week there.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Whereas, when they go to Iceland or stay in Germany or Norway, there's not a living tradition of a 7-day week. So it would be really interesting to hypothesize, and again, it would just be a hypothesis, what that first generation of Germanic-speaking immigrants to England thought about a 7-day week that they would have gotten from the Celtic peoples that they not only invaded but lived among and lived next to.
Yeah, that's well observed. That is well observed. And of course, there would be the counter case, if you could find it, of like the Visigoths in Spain.
True. So you had Visigoths in Spain. What did they do?
Yeah.
Of course, you had Franks in what we today call France and was previously called Gaul. But the difference is they adopted Latin and became Romance speakers, and they just totally picked up the Latin names for the weeks. So they don't really help us much with that, unfortunately.
Right. Yeah.
So any final comments? I think that pretty much covers everything.
No, I feel pretty good about this. Thanks so much for having me on your channel.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I know the Word Safari watchers will be very happy for all this information, and most of them know who you are anyways. If not, you should definitely go check out Jackson Crawford's channel. He talks about Norse gods and Norse culture and all of this cool stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah. Well, from beautiful Colorado, we'll wish you all the best.
See you next time on Word Safari.